So, causal loop diagram in its classic form consists of a depiction of dynamically hypothesized linkages between a set of variables. It is a model that's semi-quantitative in nature, or semi-qualitative as it were. It's not purely qualitative, it actually includes some polarities which can give you significant insight, but neither is it enough to fully simulate. You can't plug this into a model and simulate it because it's not precise enough. It doesn't have the preciseness of specification needed for the computer to unambiguously interpret it. However, it's extraordinarily useful for model conceptualization, and it's useful as a piece of models in taking that step towards building a simulation model. And so I'd like to expound on this a little bit, and I'll do a little bit of my take on some of the things that Jeff mentioned as important components as well. So within the causal loop diagram context, we're going to be illustrating the relationship between a set of different variables, and this relationship is going to lend us insight concerning the behavior of the system as a whole. So one of these feedbacks, which we've just recently seen realized, is a link between hunger on the one hand and food ingested. Now these are what I call variables. You'll notice that and this is important, you'll notice that they are given names which have clear polarity associated with it. Okay? By that I mean you know what more of it means or less of it means. It has a clear sort of sense. Okay, more hunger, it has a sense of clarity with it that saying something like more location does not. So the key is to put in variables that have a polarity associated with them, or you can have more and less in a way that communicates. These are communicational tools. What's most important is being able to communicate with this. Same thing with food ingested. I can eat more, I can eat less. Now, you can argue that there are still plenty of ambiguities, and I certainly won't dispute that, but you at least want to avoid gratuitous ambiguities associated with the naming. So, for example, if you say population, it's ambiguous. What does it mean? More population? Maybe you mean population size, as opposed to population diversity or what have you. So we like to associate these with variables with names that have clear polarity, and having placed them on a diagram, we then have the ability to put in arrows that denote causal relationships. These are not merely definitional relationships. They're not merely associations. They are supposed to be causal relationships that are being positive. So I posit that increasing hunger will increase food ingested, okay, over time. And as I ingest food, an increase in that will tend to lead to, all other things being equal, a decrease in hunger. So you notice these polarities here have meaning associated with them. And we're going to go and talk about it, the exact meaning of those components. So these links have a plus or a minus associated with them. A plus, the meaning of a plus is given here. All other things being equal, an increase in the first variable increases the second variable above the value it would otherwise have held. Okay, so if I have hunger and it goes to food ingested with a plus, it means if I increase hunger, all of the things being equal, the amount of food I ingest will be higher than it otherwise would have been, than I otherwise would have ingested if my hunger had been lower. By contrast, a negative sign means that they would vary in the opposite direction. So if I tend to increase the amount of food, it would tend to, all other things being equal, et ceteris paribus clause, all other things being equal, it would tend to lower my hunger compared to the value it otherwise would have had, in other words, in the absence of my food being ingested. You'll note that it does not say that increasing food ingestion necessarily makes hunger go down over time. It's saying that it lowers it below the value it otherwise would have had if this hadn't been changed. Hunger may still be going up, it's just it's lower than it would have been if you didn't eat that granola bar or what have you. So we have these polarities associated with links. Each link is given a polarity. Now, sometimes you will find ambiguities in terms of the polarity. So you will find one variable, when you're trying to reason through how does it affect another variable, it's not clear what polarity should be associated with it. An example is, okay, the relationship between working overtime on the one hand and the amount of work that I accomplish per day on the other. Is that positive, so I increase overtime and accomplish more, or is it negative? Well, there's reasons to argue either way. And generally, when that happens, it's an indication that there are not expressed in your diagram, there are latent paths that you could bring out. And in general, if you have a link that is ambiguous, generally the way we deal with it is by breaking out several different causal pathways that may be hidden, may be aggregated over in this representation. So for example, overtime, if I work overtime, it leads to, okay, that's, I should really say an increase in time working, which all other things being equal will lead to more work being accomplished per day. However, it also leads to a greater incorporation of tasks, of outside tasks at work. So I start making personal calls, or I start sending emails, to family members that have just got to be sent, and all of the things being equal, that will tend to lower my efficiency at work, and a lowered efficiency will tend to lower the work accomplished per day. Remember, an increase in efficiency would tend to increase the work accomplished per day compared to the value it otherwise would have had. A lowering of efficiency will tend to lower the amount of work accomplished per day compared to the value it otherwise would have had. So this pathway here, this upper pathway, is a net negative. We multiply a plus times a minus times a plus, and we get a net minus. There's a rule of signs. You multiply two negatives, they become a positive. If A leads to B with a minus sign and B to C with a minus sign, if you increase A, it tends to lower B compared to the value it otherwise would have had. Lowering B would tend to increase A, or increase C compared to the value it would have had. Therefore, there's a net positive. Two minuses cancel. So in short, ladies and gentlemen, if we have an ambiguous link, we tend to unpack it. So here we have three causal pathways. The bottom one is positive pathway, not just link, but pathway. Multiply the plus times the plus, it's net positive here. Increasing over time tends to increase work accomplished per day with the lower pathway. The two top ones tend to lower it. And we attach a special mark here, which is a double, sort of a hash mark, which indicates a delay, a long delay compared to the sort of the times represented in others of the linkages. So, if I tend to work overtime, not immediately, but studies suggest over the span of many days, it will lead to fatigue, and fatigue will tend to lower efficiency, which will then in turn lower work accomplished per day. So here we have sort of a more articulated theory about the relationship between overtime and work accomplished per day. As a good practice, you should be thinking through carefully what is the polarity associated with the links when you provide these sort of linkages, and if you spot ambiguity, try to expand it, because otherwise it will tend to be very, very confusing. Be careful to use naming, and try to use names that are not negative themselves, not negative in a normative sense, not sounding unfriendly. What I mean by negative is they should not by themselves be sort of a negation of a thing. So for example, inefficiency, I wouldn't use that as a variable. I'd use efficiency, because we as humans, through psychological experiments, have shown that we're very poor at reasoning about double negatives. If you say, I'm going to have greater inefficiency, or I'm going to have less inefficiency, our minds have a harder time processing that than if you say I have greater efficiency or less efficiency. Just a factoid about people. And it's a good thing to try to, therefore, in the diagrams, phrase things without negatives being tied in directly with them. So, I wouldn't say lack of fatigue, for example, over time lowers lack of fatigue. I would be sure to try to phrase it in a positive way. Those are a few tips associated with these diagrams. Now, I've talked about how you can go from associating polarities with individual links to associate polarities with pathways by multiplying the signs successively. These causal pathways, which are posited, will sometimes then form a loop which connects back to an earlier variable. So it leads to a situation where a change in one piece of the system leads to a rippling through set of changes which either push back against or reinforce that original change. So this was an example of a causal loop. And it's one more type of pathway. What is the polarity associated with this pathway? Anyone? This is a pathway, A, B, A. What's the polarity associated with it? Is it positive or negative? It's a negative polarity. And what that will mean is, okay, an increase in hunger, all other things being equal, it will tend to ripple through to sort of push back against itself, lower the amount of hunger. Now, that particular example is designed to be a very simple and familiar one, and one particularly suitable after lunch. But it points to something that's very important that I want to highlight back to Jeff's comments there. Within these models that we're going to be building in these boot camps, we're going to be particularly making use of hybrid models that weave together multiple types of modeling. And there's going to be pretty big emphasis on that in the course of the week. You're going to be working with many hybrid models. Many of you may choose to build hybrid models. One of the motivations for this is that it turns out that these feedbacks can be very handy in illustrating regulatory processes. And it turns out that our bodies are full of regulatory processes. Hunger is one of them. Thirst is associated with others. We have regulatory processes associated with managing salt in our bodies, associated with sleep, associated with a wide variety of types of processes. Our body has this capacity to maintain homeostasis, and that's absolutely central. And it's one of the reasons, in fact, system dynamics focuses on representing feedbacks, because feedbacks profoundly change the behavior associated with a system. So I like to do an illustration with my students, which unfortunately is not possible here because I don't have the requisite foil. I'll be with you in just a second, Daryl. But the exercise I actually undertake takes a meter stick or yardstick, and I balance it on the edge of my finger. How many people have done that sort of thing before? Broomstick and some people can be pretty good at it. They can keep it balanced, right? The key to it, of course, is feedback. You're actually observing, okay, how's it tilting? And you can do it with a region of your brain that's very quick about canceling it. But the point is you can keep it balanced by keeping it under the center of gravity. And it's because it's adaptive. It's because you're noticing it, and there's this cancellation that you're able to accomplish with your arm. If you try to do that with your eyes closed, you may knock yourself in the head. It'll fall quickly. Regulatory pathways, these pathways that keep negative feedbacks that kind of cancel out or push back against an initial change, are front and central some of the factors that define dynamics of systems, and define dynamics even at an individual level in many cases. So these models of which Jeff spoke, these models where we depict agents, and those agents are evolving over time, it will behoove you to think about regulatory processes operating those agents. Those might be regulatory processes involving stress, self-regulation of stress by an individual. It might be regulatory processes involving relationships between two individuals, where things start going in an adverse direction. There are efforts made by each side to try to come to terms. These are very key components of health and aspects of health, and also frequent needs within models. Feedback loops form sort of a key component of that, and in fact we can represent many of those regulatory processes very elegantly with system dynamics models, stock and flow models, even as part of agent-based models. So for example, we might have an individual at some level of risk that they are in fact undergoing. Maybe it's risk associated with needle sharing, or risk associated with sexual mixing. Maybe it's risk associated with hanging around with the wrong crowd at school. There's a perceived level of risk, which may track this, but with some delay. And a person may have a certain level of comfort that they have with risk, given their situation, given the alternatives, etc. And therefore, there's this sort of perception of surplus risk. How much risk is there beyond what they're comfortable with? And if it's higher than what they're comfortable with, they may undertake measures to lessen the risk. Think of yourself during a flu pandemic, or think of yourself in the context of a possible foodborne illness outbreak, or what have you. You may perceive a certain risk around you. Some of your friends got sick from eating that potato salad you bought yesterday. And some of your friends have come down with a really bad case of what seems like the flu, and you may therefore perceive yourself at greater risk and take measures to lessen risk. You toss the potato salad, or you send it to Cheryl's lab for testing. You undertake, you reduce your contact with individuals who are ill. You wash your hands more, what have you, and thereby you lower your level of risk and eventually your perceived level of risk. These sort of regulatory processes are central for many of our activities cognitively, as well as many sort of physiological mechanisms beneath the skin. And feedbacks are again quite central to this. This is an example of a negative feedback, a regulatory feedback, a balancing feedback. We use these different names to it. Any question about this sort of feedback? Yeah.
So it's not necessarily about the feedback itself, but in causal loop diagrams, frequently one does not see any specification of the time scale on which the processes are operating.
Correct.
And you can have multiple different time scales operating, whereas in agent-based models, one typically specifies the time scale pretty specifically.
That's right. I wouldn't say it's, so in a system dynamics model as well as in agent-based models, when you're going to a quantitative model, that's one of the things you have to pin down for it to be simulatable, excuse the English. For it to be able to be run, you got to pin down the time scale. You can't be loosey-goosey about it. So if we were to turn this into a full-blown system dynamics model, and as Jeff said, there would be a stock associated with it, at least one, probably a stock with level of risk, probably a stock associated with perceived level of risk as well. But there would need to be timescales defined for these things. Either way, it's not so much a matter of one tradition versus another. It's just the abstraction represented here with causal loop diagrams traditionally doesn't capture that. I tend to encourage my students to to be creative in annotating these sort of diagrams with additional components. For example, I have been known, even by some in the room, to encourage students, for example, to indicate where an intervention comes in by putting a little lightning bolt and showing sort of where an intervention affects things. Or I have been known to suggest showing mediators versus moderators using a certain diagrammatic notation to basically adapt this so that it is clear to your audience and to yourself. It has greater clarity and greater sort of conceptual coherence. And I would encourage you to do that. So you could, in fact, put next to different arrows, for example, tilde 1 week here, tilde 1 month here. In other words, this operates maybe over the months time frame and this over the weeks. But it's still not going to be sufficient to kind of fully tie it down to be simulatable. But you could do that. I have not seen diagrams like that, but I think that could be a nice little innovation if you have clarity about those time constants. So I would encourage it if you find that speaks to your needs. Any other questions about this? Yes?
It's not the specific one. So let's say that we wanted to do a policy intervention here.
Yes.
Obviously, it looks like the main way would either be to increase access to the measures to lessen the risk, like better hygiene, or perhaps the sense of appropriate risk for any given situation. But it would be inappropriate, I would think, to try to actually directly impact their perceived level of risk, because that's more or less internal.
I disagree.
No. This, I would think that this is a key link. If you could provide them a way, think about flu phone or something, a mechanism. We've actually run. Some of you may know we have a very active IFE system, and we've actually run experiments on exactly this issue of how you might clue people in at different levels to the level of risk surrounding them, therefore providing them with extra information or extra quick ability to perceive risk so that they could lower the time constant here, the delay here associated with responding. And I would say that information technologies here have some plausible role. It's not without its risks, it's not without its shortcomings, but it is possible that going from level of risk to perceived risk could be a leverage point. Yeah.
And just a follow-up, because I'm
Sure.
kind of new to something else. Is there a way to vary that delay based on other things in your model? Like, could I model someone's, for example, reliance on IT technology?
Oh, sure.
Or
Sure. Within system dynamics, if we were to capture this as a stock and flow model, you could very readily have the timing associated with this vary based on some aspect of context. Absolutely. I do want to highlight with you just 1 sec there. I do want to highlight one thing, which is, again, as Jeff said, this abstracts away. You'll notice that this abstracts away from particular events. We kind of say measures to lessen risk, but it's not saying I go to the washroom and wash my hands. I had an encounter with a friend who was sneezing, and that has kind of made me suddenly aware of risk. It tends to kind of gloss over the vagaries of those particular encounters and more be dealing in terms of sort of the patterns, as Jeff says. Daryl.
My question kind of goes back a couple of slides, but it was kind of informed by what Scott asked. When we're creating, or you're taking your ambiguous relationship between what you had before over time and work performance.
Yep.
These feedbacks or potential feedbacks that you're using to amplify your conceptual or your causal loop, do they have to be theory-based, or can it be, because you might not know the theory. So when you raise the question about perceived level of risk being a negative or a positive, do you have to know?
So models in general, so that's a great question. So the question is, as I understand it, do the relationships you show here have to be theory-based and theory-grounded? And I would say in general, models serve different uses, but they're used in different ways for those different uses. One of the uses that they form is for theory building, for helping you think through the implications of different possible theories. Another use, which is rather different, is building on fairly established or at least very plausible theory, what the literature has said, and seeing what the consequences of that are writ large, either in very particular contexts or more generally. Those are fairly different uses of models, but they use the same type of model. That's the thing. If you read the literature and you go to different papers, you will find some of them being engaged in theory building exercises and some on theory consequence exercise at work. Like, what's the consequence of this theory for the distal consequences in terms of, quality adjusted life years lived and disability, 25 years in the future, if we posit these set of connections that are fairly well established. So there are causal loop diagrams that are very exploratory, and then there are some causal loop diagrams that are based on, summaries of the literature that are much more tied down. Is that helpful? Mm-hmm. Okay, so these causal loop diagrams, one thing I want to highlight here is that the causal loop diagrams can be very useful for sort of thinking through factors. So this is from an early diagram that I was doing with Connie's group, and it's been sort of supplemented with some refined diagram. But it's a very useful tool for sort of putting out there some theory about what may be operating and thinking through in a somewhat more fluid way, some of the factors that may be involved. Just because we build the diagram with a bunch of variables in it doesn't mean we're committed to building now a quantitative model for all of it. We may start with just a piece of it being, in our quantitative model and expand outwards from there as we learn from the model. But a diagram like this can be very useful for capturing kind of your thinking in a more lightweight way of what may be operating and capturing the thinking of other stakeholders. And this is really important. This goes to Peter Hoffman's work and the work of David Anderson and George Richardson, Jack Venix in group model building. Peter being the one I consider sort of the foremost one in the health area, where he will actually build up diagrams like this with high schoolers, for example, by going into high schools and talking about bullying or talking about issues involving unplanned pregnancies, or we'll go work with church members to talk about efforts to improve physical activity and nutrition in their community. These are folks who have never seen a diagram like this before, who walking into the engagement have never been exposed to causal diagrams, but within half an hour they can understand enough of this that they can contribute at the table and saying, well, there's a missing link, or we really need to split this. This is sort of glossing over too much. So these diagrams are very useful for sketching down theory. And 2 weeks ago in UCLA, 3 weeks ago in UCLA, I led a very enjoyable afternoon with Taba and Lin Hui and others, using these sort of tools to kind of diagram out factors related to obesity within the context of LA County. They're very useful tools for sketching things down. They are not trivial to build well. And typically with my students, there's some feedback that I have to give to kind of refine the diagrams, but they're very powerful communicational vehicles. They're tools for sort of quickly getting something down on paper that people can discuss. And as Peter would emphasize, they're great boundary objects. I might talk about this later in the week if there's interest. The point is they serve to bring many people together who speak different languages, different background, but they can point to the diagram and have some confidence they're talking about similar things and refine it together in a way that would be hard if it were just trapped in one person's head and had to be communicated with all sorts of jargon. So putting it down in a place that multiple people can go to, can refine, gives a sense of ownership, buy-in, and ability to communicate, where the model like this is an asset. And ladies and gentlemen, much of the goal of this week is about building models that seek to serve as boundary objects, that can again form this link within teams, so that those models are likely to be used and not merely sit on shelves. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about this just a little bit more. These types of feedbacks are quite distinct, and I want to highlight the fact, particularly given the fact that feedbacks come in two different varieties, what are sometimes called negative feedbacks and positive feedbacks. Those are not normative labels. That doesn't mean a positive feedback doesn't mean it's a good feedback. A negative feedback doesn't mean it's bad. Instead, these are labels about the polarity associated with the loop. This is a negative feedback. It's a really good one. It keeps us alive, after all. And with a buffet like that, it tastes pretty good too, right? But it's it's very effective. It's a balancing feedback. So let's talk about these, because balancing feedbacks can be normatively positive or normatively negative, and in fact, reinforcing feedbacks, cases where a given change ripples around and amplifies the original change, can be good and they can be bad in terms of their desirability. So let's talk about this. A balancing feedback is associated with stability. It kind of brings us back into a stable state, okay? So, for example, we'll have a deviation from some state, and this balancing feedback will bring you back into that state. Deviation, again, it will bring us back. It leads to resilience in terms of maintaining a state. Now, that resilience can be good, like homeostasis, but it can be bad. So, individual self-regulation, the capacity to self-regulate in a child or an adult, it can be very effective things, but it can be undesirable. It can lead to lock-in effects, where someone who's in a very adverse socioeconomic situation, for example, tries to get a job, but it's just too hard, it's too unreliable to catch the bus to work, and it involves too many stops, or they're trying to juggle too many jobs and childcare responsibilities, and they can't keep the job, and it knocks them back into the same state. Or someone's trying to quit smoking, right? And they feel that craving, and it brings them back into smoking. So just because it's a balancing loop, that it pulls them back in a stable direction, doesn't mean that's always a good thing. We know for childhood infectious diseases, there's some very adverse negative feedbacks applying. Our very success in eradicating these diseases over the span of several decades led to complacency, people thinking they're not at big risk, led to, in fact, a lot of emphasis on vaccine hesitancy, and a lot of people opting out of vaccines, which is leading to resurgence of pertussis, chicken pox, and increasingly measles as well. So, balancing feedbacks can lead to stability, but that can be positive or it can be negative in its implications. And simply a reinforcing feedback can be positive or negative. For example, if we want to have rapid intervention success, we want to have our intervention be wildly successful, if you can have it go viral, if you can use social marketing to get your message out there and catalyze change through peer messaging and through viral marketing online or what have you, you may be able to be very successful in spreading a health promotion message. That's a good thing, right? You're getting people's behavior change. It's leading to changing norms. More and more people are adopting into this lifestyle change, which is leading others to opt in. It's a reinforcing situation. More begets more. On the other hand, you can have vicious cycles that are very adverse, where you have a sort of a death spiral or spiral down, which have very adverse reinforcing feedbacks, where loss of access to a job means lack of ability to maintain a home, which means it's hard to get hired because you don't have a home address, which means you're even more likely to lose opportunities, and therefore your socioeconomic status worsens. So we can have reinforcing feedbacks, balancing feedbacks, good or bad, in any one. But all of those we can illustrate with causal loop diagrams in this very powerful way. So, word of mouth sales and customers, more customers begets more word of mouth sales, which begets more customers. A site popularity leads to greater likelihood of being listed on search engines, and therefore greater site popularity. That leads to sort of rapid increase in say the value of the stock, whereas a negative feedback leads to sort of balancing behavior associated with the stocks. Okay. One thing that's notable is when we have a negative feedback with a delay associated with it, we can actually get cycles, oscillations. It takes some time for the system to kind of re-equilibrate, and it overshoots, and then it swings back. So causal loop diagrams can be very useful to give some high-level insights into the behavior that can result from a system. When we see positive feedbacks, we think instability and rapid, ever more fast growth until they're limited, typically by a negative feedback. See negative feedbacks, we think about balancing loops, and when we have a negative feedback with a delay, we think about oscillations. Typically, these loops are joined together, and they lead to composite behavior, often associated with shifting dominance of those loops. So, for example, more customers leads to more word-of-mouth sales, which leads to a decrease in potential customers, which limits the amount of word-of-mouth sales. A decrease here leads to a decrease in word-of-mouth sales compared to the value it otherwise would have had. And therefore, you tend to get shifting dominance over time. At first, the number of customers is growing by spreading the message and so on, but increasingly it's tapping into a smaller and smaller customer base of people who aren't yet customers who would consider buying the product, and therefore it plateaus out. So it is with many situations where we have a positive and a negative loop together. You can get this sort of plateauing behavior. Early on, the positive loop is dominant. Later on, it's this negative loop that's dominant. Okay, so causal loop diagrams are very powerful tools for sketching out your understanding of a situation, and they can be elaborated. I'm showing here one diagram, which will be in your slides, which you can look at, which goes from sort of a very small depiction of kind of the link between, associated with a spread of transmission of an infection, the population. New infections lead to higher number of infections, higher number of contacts between susceptibles and effectors, and therefore more new infections, this feedback, and then this balancing feedback. But we could elaborate it. And as you'll see, elaborating it, you could represent waning immunity, you could capture sort of risk perception and behavior change that might be posited, represent some aspects of the public health system and treatment responses and vaccination, etc. So these sort of diagrams, very useful for sort of capturing theory, often at a form where you're just thinking through the linkages in a form that's fairly transparent to stakeholders, a form that can be understood by wide varieties of individuals. Very powerful technique. Now, where do these fit into what Jeff was talking about? Well, he was noting that many of you have been exposed to these before, for good reason, because they are very powerful tools at the model conceptualization phase. But let's consider this diagram that Jeff was drawing. This diagram where we have an individual. This is sort of our possible agent, for example. And this individual might have within them state charts. An individual might be in, say, one of several states. Maybe this is never smoking, this is smoking, and current smoking, and this is former smoking. And this individual might be associated additionally with some properties, things like their sex, things like their, perhaps we'll treat it as a static for the time frame of simulation, their age, and perhaps there's some other components here as well with respect to sort of attitudes towards smoking. So, unconcerned and concerned, or some sort of other distinction that we might capture. So within this context, there might be a set of variables within this person that might link to kind of attitudes towards smoking. And we might represent those with elements of a causal loop diagram. So aspects of their social environment, for example, might influence them. So we might have other individuals represented here in kind of a stick figure form, and this leads to kind of perceived prevalence of smoking, but it might also lead to, for example, awareness of adverse health impacts of smoking, and these factors, for example, might lead to desire, perceived risks for smoking, and those might be associated with a change from unconcerned state to a concerned state. The point is, these causal loop diagrams can factor into a diagram like this one here. They could factor into the various components that link up states to each other or that link to transitions between states. So causal loop diagrams play a role in the sort of hybrid modeling conceptualization, as well as over here in the context of kind of classic causal loop diagrams for system dynamics. In addition to that, Jeff's diagram here, I wanted to also suggest that you think out for each such agent a set of particular components, and this is partly stimulated by some of Ross Hammond's sort of way of presenting these things. So the first component would be properties. Okay, what are the properties associated with this agent? So if you have an agent, if you want to depict an agent within your model, what sort of properties are associated with them? These are features that aren't really changing much over time or changing not at all. I argued earlier sex and ethnicity, for example, but it might be aspects of where they live, it might be aspects of their network, etc. So they're properties. We might also depict their state, and their state here will be depicted typically with state charts, or, and this is important, with stocks and flows. And I'm going to come to that next. So we might have a stock and a flow into it, and a flow out of it. This might be a stock associated with their weight, and there's certain types of flow ins and flows out associated with physical activity, sedentary behavior, associated with diet, etc. So there's going to be some aspects of state, some of them discrete, and some continuous. Another component that might be described in a continuous fashion might be their level of immune activation, or perhaps aspects of their stress levels you might describe in a state. Yeah?
One of your early slides showed a matrix of a whole bunch of people. And you said that you could actually have this person at a certain income level,
Yeah.
person.
Yeah.
That would be properties, right?
Absolutely. Those would be properties. So their income, their sex, and their ethnicity, those would be examples of properties here. And then there'll be some aspects of their state, things that change over time. For example, I'm a smoker, I'm a current smoker, I'm a former smoker, I'm a never smoker. That will change over time. Aspects of my my state with respect to emphysema might be an aspect of state, or with respect to asthma, right? Those might be separate state charts: asthma, emphysema, and my smoking status. Separate, not because they're not related at all. You bet they're related, but because they are fairly. We think of them as sort of distinct processes, each worthy of description, and they will be interlinked. So suppose I had a asthma state chart, no asthma and asthmatic, or something like that. I might have a likelihood of transitioning to the asthmatic state according to my being in a current smoking situation. That increases my likelihood of being asthmatic. Now, a very important component of great relevance to model conceptualization concerns the level of abstraction of this diagram. you'll notice that I have implicitly imposed a level of abstraction here. I have said basically what I'm depicting is someone's status as a current smoker. What I've not done is depict each episode of smoking, right? That would be a different model. When would you build one? When would you build the other? Well, if your interventions that you are thinking about needed to be conceptualized at the level of a particular smoking episode, for example, we're working on some technologies. Narges here, who's I guess outside right now, has done wonderful work recognizing live episodes of smoking from someone's, the data collected on their smartphones. And we could put up, a message that would remind them of their promises, or connect them to a quit line, or call their mother, or what have you. Don't you even think about it, buddy. Get back in there. I know where you're going. So if you wanted to depict an intervention at the level of smoking episodes, you might actually then have a state chart which represents, I'm smoking right now, I'm not smoking right now. In addition to this, current smoker, I'm currently smoking, or I'm not smoking. Those might be sub-states of this. I'm currently not smoking, I'm currently am smoking. Or if I wanted to, like Kurt, also outside. Kurt is working on a model which involves where he's representing smokers, but the units of analysis there, or the kind of frame at which it's put around it, is representing not episodes of smoking, but episodes of purchase of cigarettes or purchase of tobacco, because it's focused on efforts that are geared around that procurement of tobacco products, and that would shape purchasing behavior. And so he's got a model which is at a lower level of abstraction. It is more detailed than this, but it's still not depicting individual smoking episodes. Similarly, you notice with non-asthmatic asthmatic, I've abstracted away here from particular episodes of asthma. If I wanted to deal with those for some reason that was compelling for my research question, I might break those out at that level. So there's always abstraction going on here, and you're going to be wanting to think about to what degree do you really need to capture things at a very detailed level, to what degree can you kind of aggregate up. And it depends on your interventions that you're considering, what you need to measure and compare against, and what your research question is. If it's formulated around events and episodes, you're going to want to represent something that's a little bit closer to that. If your question is more about quitting behavior among adolescents, or maintaining preventing relapse among former smokers, it may be that a characterization like this is just fine. It's just fine that you're characterizing people in broad terms. Yeah, Chris.
So I just wanted to go back and just ask a clarification question. So maybe this distinction between discrete and continuous.
Yeah.
Is that a point when we're thinking about sort of the lower level architecture that we think, this component is measured in a discrete way.
Yeah.
That's state chart. That's the agent.
Correct.
Versus the continuous pieces. That's the attribute of the system.
Well, let's put it this way. If you're dealing with a continuous quantity, you should be thinking actively about system dynamics as a system dynamics construct, the stock, which we'll be building with shortly here for a brief time. You may want to think about that as a representation of that continuous quantity. So if I'm thinking about my weight, or my level of immune activation, changes in my income, if I'm thinking about aspects that relate to kind of my stress levels, it's tempting to think about representing it with a set of feedbacks and stocks and flows. Why? Well, first of all, there's often models out there which you can use that are more theory-based. There's lots of models by Guyton and others of physiological processes. There's models by Kevin Hall, which Amin back there Amin out there has represented, which are actually really rich representations of dynamics associated with these quantities. as my weight changes, my body composition changes. There's theory-based models that are well published, critiqued, and validated in that area. And so that can be very valuable. But it's also convenient, particularly, and this is the stick, folks. This is one of the key kickers, is if you want to represent regulatory processes, the fact that my perception changes over time based on my environment, or my level of weight changes based on perceived weight from those of my neighbors, and therefore my target weight accordingly. Representing it with a system dynamics diagram, a stock and flow diagram, is very favorable, and there's very nice theory-based ways of representing regulatory feedbacks within system dynamics. In fact, much of system dynamics came out of work in representing feedback-based systems that were for exactly that, sort of regulatory control. And so there's a whole sort of raft of great models and theory associated with this, including with things like work pressure, which are very relevant within the health context. On the other hand, if you have things that are discrete character, if you're thinking about agent-based models, there's every reason in the world to think about using a state chart for them, because they are factors which can be very neatly represented with state charts, and the state chart simultaneously represents not just the state, but also what Ross likes to call the actions and the rules associated with the change in that state. The actions being the things that actually lead you to change state, and rules being sort of the conditions under which those actions apply. And as Jeff said, the rules here are typically, okay, you're in this state, of current smoking. That makes you eligible for cessation, and you cease with a certain probability. Ceasing is the action. I cease is one of my actions. I uptake is another one of my actions. I relapse is another one of my actions. And then the rules are kind of what factors govern when I cease, or when I uptake, or when I relapse. Those would be factors like, okay, you can only cease if you're in a current smoking state. Doesn't make sense as I'm a never smoker, I'm going to quit smoking. Doesn't make sense. These state charts tie all these things up in a very tidy way, very tidy indeed, and so they're very natural representation. Can you capture things without that? You bet you can. You could put in an event, and we'll learn about events on Wednesday, I think. This event may fire, and it may cause me to do something different, and that event fires only under certain conditions. Those could be rules describing with that. But state charts, I think, are a crisp, transparent, and powerful way, powerfully general way of sort of depicting states, actions, and rules. Are they not, Jeff?
They are indeed.
Okay, so in addition to this, there's some elements of time involved, sort of the time horizon of the model. In any logic, by default, time is continuous. This is a good thing with a capital G and a capital T. What it means is that events happen in any logic in a sort of way that mirrors when they happen in the world. If they need to happen very, very quickly, they happen quickly. If they happen slowly, they happen slowly. You don't have to worry that you have to fit everything into a fixed tick, a fixed sort of amount of time between things happening, and then figure out, adjudicate what happened during the last interval, the last week. Did they die first, or did they graduate first? You don't have to figure those things out. Time, and then there's aspects of the environment. Aspects of the environment here could include spatial environment. We're going to have a guest lecture by Dylan, also outside, who is going to be talking about GIS models, for example. We're also going to look at continuous space and discrete space. And then there's aspects of the network environment. Who's connected with you? through what types of connections? Needle sharing connections, sexual connections, social connections, many different types of connections we might represent as part of the network environment. So when you think about defining sort of your model, think about what needs to be in there and the agents. If you want to capture it using an agent-based model or a hybrid model, you're going to be wanting to think about these elements here with respect to your model, and just be aware that state charts neatly capture all of these three and bundle them together in a most elegant way. Okay? Does this make sense? Okay. We saw those state charts earlier. We're going to be having a full-blown introduction, maybe more full-blown than you'd like, within the next day or so. Yes, question?
You can tell me you can deal with this later if not, but I'm very curious. What happens if an individual moving from one state to the next is not just dependent on a state, but it's dependent on the other individual?
Totally.
And then what would happen, for example, if your probability is dependent on prior probabilities? How do you adjust the model?
Yep. So we will see models where we have both of those two components. So, for example, where my likely developing heart disease may depend on, for example, my what my smoking status is right now, but also may depend on my history of smoking, may depend on my age as well. But more than that, where my smoking status now, the likelihood of engaging in a certain action of, for example, starting to smoke or quitting smoking might depend on the smoking status of my neighbors. And those things are readily captured. Readily captured there's one point of finesse that you have to periodically sort of recheck what this rate is, because it will be changing as your neighbors change and so on. But it's quite elegantly captured, actually, in this mechanism. So great question. Other questions? We're going to take a brief look at stocks and flows here, and then we're going to be going on to the full-blown exercise. Okay? Okay. You ready to try some hands-on things? What do you think? Okay. I hear assent. Okay. Great. So, ladies and gentlemen, I would like you to bring up your AnyLogics again, and I will.
Small models or large?
This is going to be a small model that we're going to be building, and it's going to be a model which is going to just allow us to kind of reason through some aspects of the key components of system dynamics, which are stocks and flows at a quantitative level. Okay, so I'm going to be talking about these pieces, and then we're going to be illustrating them, as it were, in real time using a little example. Okay, so ladies and gentlemen, I'm going to stop this recording here.